Hello and welcome back to Redwind's Children Youth Virtual Training Series, Restoring the Circle, Our Children, Our Blessing. I'm Hanovi Schoonover, working as support for this virtual training. If you have any questions or concerns, you can reach out to David at red-wind.net or myself for today, or via the platform's chat, you can speak to any of us. Presenting this session today are Victoria Ybanez and Maria Limon. This event does have captioning, which you'll need to manually turn on from the menu. And once again, if you have any questions or comments, you can put them to the chat box, or you can click the hand icon. Due to being muted, you will need to click the hand so that we can see it sections. And other than that, if you need anything, we will be here. And I'll now turn it over to our presenters.
You're muted, Vicki.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. I'm the director at Redwood Consulting. This is Vicki Ybanez. We're located here in Colorado Springs, and Redwood is a national tribal technical assistance provider working with the Office on Violence Against Women. And we also have another project through the Office for Victims Crime working on elder abuse in partnership with Cornell University. We are going to be talking about kind of moving into some of the nuts and bolts around a coordinated community response within the school system for children and youth. But first, I want to turn it over to my co-presenter to give her a chance to introduce herself as well. Maria?
Sorry. My name is Maria del Socorro Limon Castro, and I provide support and coaching and cheerleading for rural programs looking to build coordinated community response and sexual assault response teams. And one of the things that I've been most interested in recently is supporting, quote, mainstream programs who are operating on land adjacent to tribal governments and what that interplay can look like. It's one of the favorite things that I get to do. And the other thing that I love about this job is that I get to promote this idea of language justice. I believe that we all have our own home languages. Mine will happen to be Spanish, but we can have our own home language in English. And I think for First Nations peoples, we have home language that we speak as well. And so I love the idea that we get to slow down, to work at the speed of humanity, to work at the speed of trust, to work at the speed of understanding as we go, and find creative ways to involve our home languages as we seek to end all different kinds of violence in our communities. So thank you for having me. I appreciate it. Oh, and I work with the Center on Domestic Violence at UC Denver, originally from Texas, of Raramuri heritage, now living on the lands of many different peoples here in the Denver area. So thank you for having me.
Thank you, Maria. Can we move to the next slide? So just a reminder that some of the topics we might talk about could be uncomfortable or bring up some past memories and stuff like that. So we just really encourage you to take care of yourself, and that there's trained advocates on this call you can reach out to get some support. And then I love the one bullet in here: remember to take breaks and drink water. drinking water, something that I grew up with my mother always told us to drink water. So let's remember that as well. Next slide, please. So let's just step back and think a little bit about yesterday for those of you that were with us. We talked about trauma and trauma impacts, and we also talked about the strengths, and we talked about how culture is critical to healing as well as builds resiliency, and started to begin the conversation around coordinated community responses, which we'll get into much more deeper today. So I just wanted to check and see if anybody's got any comments or thoughts from yesterday. And Maria, did you want to offer any thoughts from yesterday yourself?
Well, I know, I don't remember seeing Kelly or Bonita or Raven who participated yesterday. Were y'all there by any chance yesterday? I don't remember your names. I'm pretty good at remembering screen names. And so I guess, do you have any thoughts or questions about what we may have covered since you may not have been able to participate yesterday? Any questions? Okay. All right. Bonita is in Fort Belknap. Okay. Thank you. Yay. Any questions, any thoughts, any concerns, anything that scares you about this topic? Okay. So I think if I were to try and capture everything that we talked about yesterday, it had more than anything to do with how we live the values that our peoples hold, how we hold those values, and then how we live them through principled actions that we can take as a way to provide for healing and justice and even prevention of abuse, trauma in children and in youth, and that we get to highlight those values, and we get to not only highlight, but I think that we get to insist that the teams of people that we develop and work with to address these issues, to address this harm in our communities, that they embrace those perspectives and those values. I would say that was my takeaway, Vicki. That's what I came away with understanding yesterday. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think as you were talking, it was making me think a little bit more about yesterday. And one of the critical pieces in there is that for me was that we have this opportunity to make a difference in people's lives that can have long lasting change for them. And so it's about for me, part of it's about how are we being intentional in this time and space. And we may never see the outcome some of us may be fortunate in some instances to see the outcome, and other times we may not. But our intentionality is a critical part of being able to heal our communities. We're dealing with multiple intersections of trauma, intersections of oppression, and out of that, using the strengths and beauty that our culture provides us for the healing of our community. And one of the things that I know I mentioned it a couple times yesterday was that as we work with this one individual, this one family, as we heal them, are engaged in our healing work, we in fact are healing our communities.
And if I could add, we're healing ourselves. I mean, to be honest, I know that my people and my family have all suffered great harm And I love how, as we do this work, we don't set ourselves aside. We do this for us as well as for the people who we seek to serve and honor in our work. So thank you.
Yes, and I love that, always remembering that we're healing ourselves. And sometimes as we're working with the really hard stuff, we have to be really intentional about that, about how we ourselves are healing ourselves. Next slide, please. Just a reminder that you're safe here. This is a safe space. And as a part of it, our job as advocates, we're providing support and encouragement, working with people where they are, helping survivors to have options, and multiple other aspects of our work, which an advocate, when I was working in direct services, I started to realize that we really do have this multifaceted role as we're working with people, and it shifts and change all the time based on where people are at and what they need at the time. And so yesterday we also talked briefly about how advocates have been a lot of the leaders of the change in this work, addressing anti-violence work around domestic violence, sexual assault, stalking, dating violence, and sex trafficking. And I think it's really important for us as advocates to recognize our leadership role in this work as well. Next slide, please. And then, of course, a big part of why we're here is about working with our children and youth and supporting them as they're facing the challenges of trauma in our community. And so through that, and as we're moving toward talking about a coordinated community response, we're working to create protective environments. And one of the aspects of a CCR is that we always center that victim in everything we do. And so in this work, as we think about it within a school system, that in everything we do, we need to be thinking, how is this going to support, provide strengthened or enhanced responses, and protect children and youth in every aspect of what we're trying to do. Because the last thing we want to do is to create any unintentional harm or backlash to children and youth in the work that we're doing. We're still also in work with children and youth. We're going to have contact with that non-offending parent who is often a victim of domestic and or sexual violence or any of the other crimes I mentioned just recently. So we're going to be working with that victim as well. But we're starting with those children and youth. Next slide, please. So we're going to spend time talking about that coordinated community response, or creating a community-centered response to trauma, to children and youth within the school systems. And one of the things that I just wanted to speak briefly about the model itself. So coordinated community response was actually, that model was developed in the 1980s. It was an outgrowth of work out of what was occurring in Duluth, Minnesota. I was fortunate to be living in Duluth at the time and be a part of that work as it was emerging. It's a CCR, coordinated community response, is an approach communities or institutions use to achieve a shared goal or vision across various disciplines. And the original model was about a systems change model, and the institutions were within the criminal justice system. And that has evolved over time. because it's been such a great model. People have seen how that they can make minor tweaks and variations to it and use it in different kinds of approaches. So CCR is a multifaceted approach to addressing violence against women, violence against our relatives, with a community, system, or an institution. Yesterday I mentioned about a CCR, and while this model was an outgrowth, a systems change model was an outgrowth of the work in Duluth, Minnesota in the 80s, one of the things that's important for us to recognize, the concept of a coordinated community response is an indigenous model. So when we think about our tribal communities prior to colonization, even through some of the years of colonization, as we operate within a tribe, within our communities, our tribe has operated in a coordinated response for the protection of the community, for the safety and the well-being of the community. And a friend of mine that Marlon Musso, who is Ogallala Kota, he and I were out providing a CCR training with the 8 Northern Pueblos back in the early 2000s, like 2000, I want to say 5, 6, or 7, somewhere in that range. And he and I, as we were doing some of our planning, started talking about that. And he actually drew out on a scrap of paper, I think it was a napkin on the table, like he talked about, the protectors, that protected the boundaries, the warriors that made sure that the boundaries were safe, and he bridged the connection to law enforcement. He talked about the people that were the ones that ensured that there were the foods and the resources that the tribe needed, and talked about, that's the social, some of the social service works and some of the other system works. And he talked about the healers, and he said, so then we look at the medical response in current day. And he talked about those that are caring for the elders and the children. And again, he got to talking about current day caregivers that we have. And he walked through all of the different aspects in there. And in the core of it, that within a CCR, he talked about that those that are most vulnerable are who we hold in the center. Whereas out of the Duluth model, it holds advocates, which carries the voices for victims as the center of that model. But in the indigenous model, it's who do we hold the most sacred and that are the most vulnerable and need the most protection, which were the children and the elders. So I just want to make sure that everybody understands that while we're talking about a more modern time mainstream model, that we can really look back to our indigenous ways and actually reflect and see that the concept of this model has been around from time immemorial within our tribes.
The one thing that I like to think about as it relates to coordinated community response teams is that it is the basis of it is community. And you're right, it does speak to those communal connections as a way to address any problem. And the one thing that I have seen recently is that there's a shifting about who should be included in a coordinated community response team. For a stretch there was this assumption that it was designed to make things run smoother for anybody who was dealing with violence and had to interact with the criminal justice or the justice system. And what we have been seeing is that is no guarantee that anybody who has been forced to manage the effects of violence at the hands of somebody they love, it's not going to guarantee safety. And so in order to think about safety, in order to think about justice, in order to think about healing, we have to think about that team in broader ways. And so it can include unlikely partners as well. I know in one community, they included a group of Walmart employees because everything happens at Walmart. And so the employees were concerned. And so that's the one thing that I like to remind people, that it can include really unlikely partners. And because ultimately everybody has an investment in making sure that children are safe, that children are protected. Yeah, I think that's what I wanted to add. Thank you.
Yeah, and as you were saying that, Maria, it was making me think about, so within our tribal communities, then some of the partners that we don't see in the non-native CCRs is that we want to make sure our tribal leadership is involved. So we don't necessarily want to say, oh, hey, here, all of the tribal council to sit in on the CCR meetings. They don't have the time and space or energy for that, and it's not going to be a best use of their time. But we need to build in regular connection and communication with our tribal leadership. And this is something that we've been talking about for the last few decades, about it as being an important part for the longevity of the work that we want to do. Because if we don't have the buy-in and support from our leadership, our projects can just disappear as a result of that. So I've encouraged CCRs to think about that, and how can you involve and engage tribal leadership in a way that's meaningful for them to be present. And one example or one way that I pose back to folks is have them come in on quarterly basis where you're celebrating and recognizing your milestones and successes and talking about some of your challenges, so that they are abreast of what you're working on, what you've been working on, and where you're going with the work. And you can pull them in at different times. So particularly if you're working on policy or tribal code, you would want to have them have at least a representative from tribal leadership involved with that, because it's going to have to go before tribal leadership for approvals. So having them involved is a great idea. And I was thinking about one tribe that I visited a few years ago, and when we were doing our initial tribal CCR training, we had 4 members from tribal council that were sitting in on the training, which was really valuable. And what I knew about that CCR team over the following years was 2 of those members continued to stay involved on a regular basis and were a liaison back to the full tribal leadership, which was incredibly valuable to them.
And we know that that comes with other complications too, depending on who's on tribal leadership. There's ways of finding the informal leaders as well as the more formal designated leaders in tribal communities. Yeah, it's beautiful what people come up with. I love that. Thank you.
Right, and another critical partner, critical person or people to be involved are our spiritual and traditional leaders. And so within Navajo Nation, we talk about traditional practitioners, which are our spiritual people. And the language is going to vary from tribe to tribe on how they describe that. But having that presence is really critical, because as we're thinking about creating things, modifying things, changing things, we want to center it and steep it in culture. And we want to have it framed from within our custom, and not replicating mainstream models, but having those experts that can bring that perspective to the conversation to help us understand how that's, where does this come from and how does that fit today? Just as my friend Marlon Musso took and just framed out what a CCR looked like from a Lakota perspective, and he actually had the Lakota words in the way he diagrammed it out. And that has stayed with me forever. And I think that having those people involved at the table, and then also the other aspect of why it would be important is because we want to engage in healing work as well. And so the healing work of those that we're working with, so those children and youth, those adult non-offending parent victims, as well as the healing work of our team. So for instance, one CCR that I worked with is that so I mentioned about inviting tribal leadership like on a quarterly basis or something like that, where they are looking at and celebrating their milestones, where they've come from, where they're going, that kind of an approach. Because of the spiritual person they had involved with their CCR, that was the time when they feasted their work and brought in prayer to their work. And as they were working in between those times and things would get hard, they ensured that the team took the time to do what they needed to do culturally to ensure things were going in a good direction and that their well-being was cared for along the way as well.
Sweet. I was wondering if Bonita or Kelly or anybody else had any thoughts to add about what your experiences have been in terms of involving community leaders or tribal leaders in any of the work that you do. And do you have any thoughts or concerns or stories that you may want to share? I'm curious about Fort Belknap, Montana.
Are you?
I really am.
Okay. Well, in the community here in Fort Belknap, we have response to 4 outlying communities, and we have very little staff. We're very understaffed here in Fort Belknap. So if there's a call in the main agency is where the law enforcement department is. So if there's a call in the law enforcement, at one point we only had 3 officers for 4 outlying communities. And so for that response time, that was not something that was good. And so there are barriers on reservations that are very prominent. And I don't think that we're the only reservation that has those hardships or barriers because of the understaffing. Yeah. The academy trained officers, sometimes because of the pay, they will leave and seek employment somewhere else where they can support their family at a higher living in a better environment, I guess.
Thank you. That is so true. I know I'm from Texas, and along the border, there are programs that are having trouble keeping staff because the oil industry has come in, the fracking industries have come in, and they will pay a receptionist a starting salary of $70,000. So people leave. They've been having a lot of trouble keeping staff. And it's interesting because it's happening at a time when a lot of the First Nations peoples in Mexico are having to flee, like from the state of Michoacan, where avocados come from. It's one of the major crops. They're having to leave because the cartels, because of legalization of marijuana here in this country, they're now wanting to control the avocado trade. And so that's introduced all kinds of issues. And as it relates to domestic violence and sexual violence programs, they are having to, for example, think about building bomb-proof shelters because the cartels have access to military-grade weaponry, and there's so many complications whenever we think about, whenever I think about the realities for First Nations communities and what they're having to contend with. And definitely the lack of staff and funding support is huge. I'm sorry about that, Benita. All right.
Thank you.
Yeah, I agree with Benita's point also about limited staff. And so a lot of CCRs, like if I think about like in urban, like small to large cities or large towns, they have like a regular schedule, like we're going to meet every, second Tuesday of the month and go with an approach like that. And the more remote and smaller the size of the community, that's not going to be feasible because you might have a CCR, you might have a SART, you might have an MDT, and all of those things have some core people in there that are working across the same. And then if there's a community emergency, like 3/4 of that team is gone, if not all of them. And so one of the things I've seen were some of the tribes where they've created hybrids where they've combined some issues. And then I've told them, if you do a combining, you've got to be really clear so that one doesn't get lost in the process. So that you make clear that this day is 75% on this topic and a smaller percent on that one. And you have some proportional balance so that all of the topics get covered that need to be covered. But you don't say like, we've got an hour to meet and everybody gets 20 minutes, because it's not going to be productive for the team to do that kind of work. But find a way that you're sharing the time in a way that's meaningful to each of the topic areas you're focused on, and kind of spreading it around a little bit. And that's helped to some degree, but it also has its challenges because some people find some of the topics more preferable to talk about, comfortable to talk about than other ones. And so you've got to really make sure you've got a strong, solid facilitator that can ensure that you're focusing on the kind of work that you're supposed to be working on at the time. Which then opens another piece in there for me as we think about the work and the role of the coordinated community response. So as we think about it in the context of for working within the schools, the coordinated community response is going to engage key partners from on and off the school to develop and oversee all aspects of school prevention and responses to domestic violence, sexual assault, and stalking. And so also thinking about implementing, reviewing, and revising protocols, policies, and procedures. So when I think about that, what are these policies, protocols, and procedures? Because if you aren't familiar with them, it's like, okay, that's really broad. What are we working on? So part of it for me is about, I would want to know, for instance, if as a teacher, I'm coming in contact with a child in need, how do I seek help for this child? What's the process to do it? What are the challenges in there and the protections for that child, with disclosure as far as that? So that just that example right there, there's some policies and procedures that need to be outlined to make sure everybody has consistent information so that appropriate protections are in place, as well as resources are identified and who talks to who about this. So it's not one teacher talking to another teacher, talking to another teacher, then it finally gets to the vice principal and, it never makes it to the guidance counselor. And, so that there's a process of who does that teacher go to and what can that teacher expect when they go to that point of contact, and what is that role of that point of contact when that teacher goes there. So it's those kinds of things that you would develop as a part of what's our process here, and you document that process. And then with that, I would want to think about, how do people know? So yeah, you've created these beautiful policies and procedures. How do people know they exist? So you're ensuring that there's training going on for everybody that needs to know. And in that, you know, I think about back in school, you know, like you come into the school and there's someone at the front desk. Like you could think about, okay, it's the teacher, it's the guidance counselor, it's the vice principal, but what about the person at the front desk or the janitor? That they might also be, it might be important for them to know as well. How do you ensure children are safe? What do you do when you have information? Because it's those people who are not necessarily in prominent positions that often see a lot or are privy to a lot of information. So we want to make sure that plays out as well.
Yeah. I think another way that people can see how, for the transparency that you were talking about, the one thing I've seen is that the teams that live the core values in the community, it makes a world of difference. It just makes a world of difference to the entire community, because you never know when you're going to run into, you have a team member who's out in the community and they behave in a particular way that upholds, they're taking principled actions that uphold the core values that the team is wanting to promote, and people notice. People will notice, and that's another way of just letting people know what your values and what your principles are, just by living them in the community. Yeah, they pay attention.
Right. And yeah, and so it's like, we need to make sure the community knows this is happening. That there's this process in there that, for me, when I think about a CCR, as we're periodically going through and reviewing our work, how are we informing the community of our work as well? So yes, it's important to inform our tribal leadership within tribal government, because that's a critical part of our long-term sustainability. But we also need to make sure tribal members know what it is. And I would want them to know, this is what happens if a child disposes. This is who's trained and how they're qualified to respond in here, and what some of the supports are. Because there may be people in the community that are sitting on a situation because they don't know what to do with it. And being informed is going to provide them some guidance as well. Or maybe, you know, they're going to get, you know, someone's going to reach out to them and say, this is what's going on with this child in school right now. And as an informed community member, they're going to go, oh yeah, and this is what I know what your process is. This is what I know that I can expect, and not feel fearful of the communication with the school. And I think another role of the CCR is that we learn each other's jobs. Because we sit at a table oftentimes, and this was a lesson that I learned many years ago, sitting at a CCR, in a CCR team. And I kept thinking, like, I'd look at law enforcement, like, why aren't you doing this? And why aren't you doing that? And I was making all these assumptions about their job. And then when I got educated about what they could and could not do, I realized some of what I was asking was unreasonable. And, you know, and then, yes, even though there were a few that were a little unreasonable, it's like, let's figure out then, how can we adjust some of these things within these limitations that you've got, so that we can help address where the barriers are as well. So the more we know what each other does and what guides them, whether it's, you know, what kind of rules, laws, policies, things like that guide them, that as we're sitting together at the table working on these different issues, we can have reasonable expectations of each other. And when we something kind of butts up against those rules, we can say, is this something that we can fix in a reasonable amount of time, or is this a long-term project to fix? Like if we're going to make a change to the tribal code, we're not going to be able to make it in the next month or two. But we may be able to get that done within the next year or two, and not just throw up our hands, oh, it's in law, so we can't do anything about it. We can still do things that take bigger timelines to accomplish.
We're almost there. What is it? Stupid candies. We'll get them at the store.
I want to be there playing. Oh, baby.
And then I see that Bonita put in the chat, sometimes it's the school staff that are sitting on situations, and what we have discovered is that school boards are set up to protect the teachers. And I went to a school board meeting and advocated for a child and their issues with bullying. And I asked when we are going to flip that and begin to protect our children. Our school population is over 90% Native, and the attitude in regards to child safety are very aloof. We recently had a teacher arrested for inappropriate photos to schoolgirls. Yeah, and that's part of it. So with a CCR, so our jobs are to centralize the safety and protection of the children, being able to respond to the trauma that they're experiencing and to foster resiliency for those children as a part of it. And so as we bring people together and, and we put that issue on the table, that could be one of those areas that we could start working on to figure out how do we raise the level of protection of our children when we know that one of our core values is recognizing that our children are sacred to us.
I think the other thing that can happen is that by having a variety of people on your coordinated community response team, as the team members train each other on what their jobs are and on what their programmatic priorities are, I think the other thing that happens is that understanding leads to the kind of culture that raises the bar, as you said. When there may be a school administrator on a team and there may be an advocate or maybe somebody who works with, child protective services or whatever that is involved in on the same team, they're going to start to help each other identify the spots that they're missing. And I am not surprised that this happened in your community, Bonita. I work with schools here in high schools in Denver. I work in 4 different high schools, and there was a sexual assault on campus. And the school administrator, the school should have had a Title IX coordinator in place. There should have been particular protocols that were followed. And in that situation, the team of students who I work with were better informed about Title IX protocol and policy than the principal was, which was shocking, but it's real, which is one of the reasons why I always advocate that young people who are in our communities, who are aware of what is happening, become a part of a coordinated community response team as well, in ways that are appropriate, right? Not everybody would be able to do it. Not every young person has the level of maturity, but I have to tell you, these young people just blew my socks off. They were so informed about consent. They were so informed about protocol and practices that it was jaw-dropping. And I have to say that it is a testament to the work that we've done in our movements to end violence, that is in place for people, that these young people knew, understood consent. They understood boundaries and limitations and all of that. It was such a testament. And I think that finding ways to involve them and support their leadership around these issues will also go a very long way. Yeah, it's been very humbling, I should say, very humbling. Yeah, and hopeful.
I love that, Maria. Because I do think our children have a lot to say, and they have a very, very strong voice. And there's through the Office of just Juvenile OJJDP, Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Programs. So that's a federal agency, and OJJDP every year or every other year holds a tribal summit for children, for youth. So it's a certain age up into teens. So I can't remember exactly. I want to say like 11 or 12 and older. And I had the good fortune to go to one of them one year. And we took 10 kids from 4 different tribes and brought chaperones from those tribes as well on that particular trip. And it was a week-long summit that took place in Santa Fe at the Art Institute down there. And they had the kids and the chaperones all stayed in the dorms and stuff. And there were rules that we all had to follow. And the thing that I found really amazing was that part of this, so it was a leadership summit for the youth. And part of the process in there, while there were multiple departments, so OVW, so Redwood was doing training on dating violence and across the sessions. And so multiple departments from the DOJ were had TA providers in there doing trainings with all of the youth, and they had them in batches that they were moving around. So every group of youth that was moving through the training received all the same sessions, even though they weren't in the same together. And then the general sessions was leading toward youth becoming prepared to provide a consultation to the federal department heads, which was powerful to see. And so our group of youth, we were working with them, helping them to think about some of what do they want to talk about within their tribe. And then we worked with some of the youth out of our 10 kids that went on that trip. 4 of them led a general session piece together. We had one adult staff that was going to share the stage with them and to assist with the facilitation. And within 20 minutes, he was sitting on the side of the stage because the 4 of them just handled it so beautifully. And it was an hour-and-a-half session. And in the consultation, each of the youth from each of the tribes that were present at that summit brought, this is what we need as youth in our community. This is what we need from you as tribal leaders. These are the problems you have not given attention to. And they did that to the department heads and what they needed to come back to their tribes. And then what I do know out of the group of 10 that we brought there, a part of them, like 60% of our group, went back to their tribes and met with tribal leadership and told them directly about what they needed from tribal council as well. It was powerful and beautiful and amazing. And so I think that there's ways, like within a CCR, to think about how you create advisory boards, committees, steering committees, what have you, with the leadership of tribal youth within your CCR that are going to reflect back. And then one more story that I want to tell, because we were doing a lot of work at that summit on dating violence. And there was this young man from the Choctaw Nation, and within their school system, they had a youth advisory group that was looking at the issues around dating violence and taking an approach about prevention and response. And the young man that came, he was, because I got to talk with him quite a bit, he shared multiple stories with me about what they were doing. And he was the chair of the advisory committee. I think he was like 15 years old, something like that. And they were training themselves, working with the advocacy program within that group. And then they were doing the education within the schools. So it wasn't the advocates going into the schools doing the education. The advisory team was being trained to do that training with their peers. And then they were taking it into the lower grades. And it was more well received with them. And he was dynamite. He was just really strong, the confidence. And part of that work, and he talked about as a part of getting involved with that advisory committee, was he found his voice in that process too. So it was really beneficial back to the school and the community, but it was beneficial for him as a leader.
Yeah. Yeah, I think one of the caveat that I always issue with people when they want to include youth in any team that is ostensibly been built by a program. I don't care how down you are with young people. I don't care how rooted you are in your own tribal understanding of the world. There are still ways that adultism creeps into our minds, and it affects the ways that we work with young people. And I always encourage any adults who are going to be working to support the leadership of young people to monitor how much space they take up when they're speaking. I also encourage them to think about how playfulness has been squeezed out of their own life. Because if we sit in there with young people who are ready to go and we don't know how to play, we don't know how to keep things light with them, the issue's serious. But if we get so serious, they're not going to want to participate. They will go away. But if we're able to go ahead and do that, we're able to go ahead and work on the ways that adultism affected us when we were coming up. It makes a huge difference. I cannot explain to you in the interactions that I've had with young people. I still tell fart jokes, for example. And the young people will inevitably say, I want to hang out with you because this other person, they don't know how to play. I mean, it's a real thing. It is a real thing. And so, those are the things that I keep in mind. The other thing that I remind people about is that when I go into, for example, a high school, and I knew that I was going to be working with 9th and 10th graders as opposed to older, there's a huge developmental difference between those groups. It's huge. The 9th and 10th graders are coming out of, are just, taking a deeper dive into their hormonal puberty and adolescence. And the older students are coming out of it. And there's this very interesting leap between 10th and 11th grades that I have noticed. This level of maturity and an understanding of the world, the higher functioning brain is starting to kick in more. And so what I do is that I before I go in to work with them, I will ask a colleague, an adult colleague, to sit with me as I think about what my experience was in the 9th and 10th grades. I ask myself, what did the adults do that was harmful, dismissive, disrespectful, because it's real? And I have to go ahead and look at my own experience, because if I don't, I will do the things that I swore I would never do to young people because I hated it when adults did it to me. But if we don't find ways to interrupt that dynamic, it will replicate. Every parent knows this. I'm helping raise a 16-year-old. I swore there were things I would never do. And did I do them? Yes, I did. I did. And it's just human. And so that's the other thing. I have people investigate their own story at different ages and call it adultism. The one thing I would be careful of is don't talk about adultism as a term, because unfortunately, when you Google that term, a porn site comes up as the number one.
Oh my God.
Right. Don't do that. I can forward you some really good articles about what adultism can do and how adults can find ways to set that aside. Just like we want our white colleagues, and to think about the way that racism affects their ability to work with us and support us. We have that obligation to young people as well, to think about how the adultism that we that we hold, how that affects our ability to work with young people as well. It's powerful work. It's not easy, but it is so worth it. Processing before and then after. I had a teacher friend who could listen to me, and I would listen to him, and we would just go, this is what I said, but what I wanted to say was, I wanted to put this young person down. I wanted to tell them to shut up. I wanted, but we didn't do that because it doesn't make sense, but we needed to process that. So that's the thing that I'll talk about when it relates to engaging young people as a strategy, but supporting their leadership is the real goal.
I love that.
Yeah.
I love that. And I think about that young man down in Santa Fe and how confident he was. And when we were doing planning for the session they were going to facilitate, and he just talked about how, like a year ago, he would never have volunteered to do that. And his sense of self was so much stronger. And I knew one of the people that worked with the youth within that tribe, but I never got to witness that. But there was so much confidence coming from him, and listening to the stories of the work that they did was just amazing. And there's that assumption oftentimes that we have to help them do it because they don't know what they're doing, and not realizing that they've got the skills and we're their resource. And we need to let them pick up the resource if they want it. And if they don't need it, get out of their way. Like I think about their co-facilitator, and I was passing out some, my job was passing stuff out to the audience. And when I turned around and realized he was sitting on the edge of the stage with his legs dangling off, he just got out of their way, because they totally had it. And I love that. And I think that is such an important lesson, is to, recognize the strength and experience and knowledge that our youth already have.
I like to think of adults as who are supporting young people. Our job is to set up the bumper pads, so they don't run in too hard into the walls as they're flexing their intellectual muscle, right?
Mhm.
As they're doing that, to go ahead and find ways to, help them bounce back from some of the hard spots, and to encourage mistakes, to encourage experimentation, to encourage things that stretch the boundaries that even I feel comfortable with, because there is a level of impatience that we must honor, that they hold, because they see what is happening and they understand what violence is doing, and they have a broader perspective of it than I do, because they're able to make these connections. If I could share a story of Team Unstoppable working with the team of young people who developed this wonderful logo. They call themselves an unstoppable movement that is using humanity's compassion and love to end all forms of violence and abuse. They taught me to not say healthy relationships. They roll their eyes. They're like, we're sick of people lecturing us about bullying and healthy relationships. And so we decided that we're talking about non-toxic, drama-free relationships of all kinds. with adults, with your family, with your friends, with your boothing. That was one thing that I learned. And then the other thing that I learned about them is that young people between the ages of 14 and 20 roughly, people refer to them as Gen Z, but what before that term stuck, the people who come up with those terms, which are marketing firms, right? Advertising firms, they were using plurals because this is a generation that sees themselves in a very different light than we did when we were that age. They see themselves more pluralistically. They see themselves living in a more plural society. And because of that, their gender identities, for example, are more fluid. They have so many different ways of seeing themselves, expanding definitions and limitations. And what they were able to do was to develop their mission statement. I said their mission statement, they had 5 principles, 5 core values. And one of them was love. And in their mind, love meant, they defined it as not allowing or interrupting the ways that any of us believe the horrible stereotypes about ourselves or other groups of people, right? That was their definition. And this was a group of Muslim kids, Native kids. They were just, it was very mixed. And a week after that meeting, I show up with the materials that we have to work with that day, and I forgot something important. And I said, oh, I hate myself when I forget this stuff. I can't believe I was down on myself. And one young woman raised her hand and said, Maria, can I say something? I said, sure. I thought you had a question. And she said, it's not okay for you to talk about yourself that way. It's not okay for you to say that. So they immediately were putting into work the core values that they had decided for themselves and modeling it in this way that was breathtaking and necessary. I will never forget that moment. I lost it. I didn't realize how the internalized racism was running, how the internalized colonization and genocide was running in my mind at that moment, but she spotted it. And she said, we don't have to do that, with so much compassion and tenderness. So that's the other benefit of having young people lead on a coordinated community response team. It is not easy, and it is totally worth it.
That's a beautiful story. I love that. Next slide, please. One of the things when we think about coordinated community response, I think it's really important for us to think about it as a holistic report or a holistic approach to solving problem within the school response and the response to children in our community. Because as we're doing that, while we want to center this CCR within our schools, we also want to remember that these children only spend a portion of their day in their school. So they're connected into the community. And when we think about that as a holistic approach, and I think about who should be at the table, so there's the likely people, so we want to have some teachers, and we want to have, someone from administration or a few people from administration. We want to have the guidance council. If you've got school security, we want to have that. We would probably want to have, and of course, I would say we absolutely want to have the DV or sexual assault program being present as well. But there's other aspects in there. I want the coach there. I want the dance. If there's someone within, like I took modern dance for a few years when I was in high school, I would want the dance teacher there too. Art and music, and where our youth connect, we really want to think about that they're going to be critical people that should be there as well. So we think holistically about this, about the child and the children and youth that are connecting. And in there, those should be a part of it. So the holisticness is not only holistically who should be at the table, but also our approach to how we're going to work with children. We're not going to silo them. We want to make sure that their needs are met as a whole human being, in all the sacredness that they carry as little people in our society.
Verlene just joined us. Hey, Verlene. We're in the middle of it. So thank you so much for joining us and taking the time.
And so as a part of it, we're going to build knowledge in the CCR work that we're doing. We're building knowledge within the team, but we're also building it within the knowledge within our children and youth in our school system and within our tribal community. We want to make sure that community members are well informed as well. We're going to do skill building. So we're going to make sure that the key staff, the key responders, the people who are in positions of getting information are all well informed and have skills built and developed to be good responders to children and youth. We're going to create tools and resources as a part of it, and we're going to create policies and procedures that guide us. And I say that guide because if it isn't a natural fit to work one way, we need to adjust to the needs of who we're working with. We're going to do it in a way that's trauma informed. It's relative centered. So we're recognizing those that we're working with as our relatives. These little persons in front of us are our relatives, just as well as the non-offending parent and victim is a relative as well. And we're going to make sure that all of the work is centered around the safety and the needs of those of that child or youth, as well as the non-offending parent. And we're going to do it in a way that's culturally informed and culturally centered. And then we want to make sure that we're all ready, prepared, and we're working as a well-connected team together, that we have worked out as many kinks as possible, because we're dealing with real lives and trying to build resiliency in the process. Next slide, please. So when we talk about building resilience in our classroom, it's important in that process. When I think about resiliency, like, we can talk about it and we can say, okay, we want you to do this, but we want to make sure that people understand what they're doing and that they really have enough knowledge and connection to it as well. So as we talk about that knowledge and connection, as we're talking, for me, as I'm talking with a teacher, I want to make sure that I'm spending the time where we can really connect as human beings about this and engage in dialogue. So we're sharing and exchanging ideas and helping to build that framework. So when that teacher goes into that classroom and whoever's teaching and providing education around a whole range of different issues, that they understand resilience and they're doing it from a resilience approach, which to me is about being relative centered. When I think about being relative centered and recognizing, that we as an Indigenous people are all relatives of each other, that means that I'm going to do this work with the most love and respect. That's going to be centered in everything that I do. And I love the way Maria has been talking about, that we slow things down. We are not operating and being rushed through something. We don't overpack it. We create time for us to build trust and connection with each other and to have dialogue. Next slide, please. And so healing starts with us. I always tell advocates when I'm training advocates is that we can only work with a victim and take them as far as we ourselves have gone. And if we haven't done our healing work, we're not going to be able to help them go very far. We can do the mechanical stuff. We can help, as an advocate, we can help a survivor get a protection order. But if we haven't done our own personal work, we're not going to help them understand and make sense of all of what's going on around them. And so when I think about healing starts with us, is that for us to be able to work in the school, we need to be in a really good place. We need to be in a place where we have done a lot of personal work. We understand our limitations and our shadows as we go into that work, and our, people talk about our buttons. To me, part of that's limitations and shadows. And we need to know ourselves well, because we have an opportunity to get it right. And one of the things I also believe about education is if we make mistakes in the way we're trying to build relationships, and we set the wrong tone, share the wrong information, things like that, it's harder to undo it than to start and get it right in the first place. And so that means that for me as somebody, if I were going into the school, I need to make sure that I am really clear about my approach and who I'm starting with, and what's the message that I'm wanting to bring into them, and why do they want to be involved with the CCR? And if I don't understand that, I can't communicate that.
Right. And one of the Zapatistas, the Chiapanecos in Mexico, when they started their organizing in support of their communities, one of the principles that they had was nothing about us without us. And you cannot have a secret personal agenda. It has to be, you can have a personal agenda, it cannot be secret. Your agency can have an agenda, it cannot be secret. And so you're right to inquire why people want to be involved. Yeah, absolutely. We want to be clear.
I love that. Nothing about us without us. There's another thing. I was reviewing some material and doing some reflecting the other day, and I did some work with the Washington State Coalition Against Domestic Violence, and Nan Stoop, who is their former director. She, through some of her work, she would talk about the beloved community, and that the work that we do is to care for that last girl, is the way she would talk about it. And it's that one that nobody is thinking about, nobody's giving attention to, and they're working kind of on the easier side. We're going to work with these people, but this last girl is more complicated. This last girl, her issues are more hard. This last girl, I don't know what to do with her. And Nan Stoops would talk about our work is that we must always think about that last girl, because if we're serving that last girl, we're able to serve everybody else. And so when I think about the healing work and the work that we do, and that nothing about us without us, is that if we're including those that we're working with and wanting to serve, we're hearing what their needs are in a clear way, so that we can have a better understanding of what those needs are of that last girl. And they're going to help guide us in that process as well. So I'm really excited about that.
That is cool. Oh gosh, I wanted to just check in and see if Verlene, Benita, Kelly, or Jovita. Welcome, Jovita. Thank you for joining us. I hope I pronounced your name correctly. I read that as Jovita, one of my sheroes back in Texas. So I hope I pronounced that correctly. Do y'all have any thoughts? This was a lot that we covered. I'm wondering if y'all have any thoughts or questions or ideas, or do you disagree with me? You're welcome to do that. Or Monica as well. Monica, any thoughts or questions you wanna drop in here?
Personally, I really loved all of the information that was put forward with the presenters here. I really appreciate that work. I have been going into the schools since 2009 to 2000, well, just till a couple years ago. And that's one of the things that we did teach in the schools was resiliency. And we used a curriculum called Making Proud Choices. And it's a curriculum that was developed out of the state of Hawaii. And we weren't able to do the complete modules in there just because we were only given a 2-week span during their health classes. But I really loved this presentation. Thank you.
And the one thing I forgot to say is that if y'all weren't out there in your communities trying to think about young people and think about the healing for your communities and uplifting the voices of survivors in your communities, I wouldn't have this job. I wouldn't be here. So that makes you the boss of me. And please keep that in mind. I do mean that. I really do mean that. I used to work at the National Domestic Violence Hotline, and I would, whenever I was working with somebody, and if it was appropriate, I would say, "So how did I do, boss? How did I do? What's my employee evaluation?" And I would do it to make them laugh, to encourage laughter, and then I would say, "No, seriously, I mean it. What was helpful? What really helped you here today? Because I want to learn from you, so that it can help the next caller." And so I mean that here as well. You are the boss of me. Call me. I've got a ton of ideas. I'm really good at helping people identify the ways that racism and the internalized genocide and colonization get in our way. And I'm really good about, with deep love and compassion, helping people make plans that build off of our strengths as we tackle these big issues. I am available to you. I included my number here. You know, I'm going to include my other, yeah. So if you need anything, please remember you can contact me. Yeah. Thank you.
That's great, Maria.
Yeah.
Next slide, please. So we're wrapping up right now. So as we think about it, our power is in our beliefs, understanding the past to help our future. And when we think about our past, oftentimes we think historically, and we go back hundreds of years. And yes, that's important as well. But we also need to think just about yesterday as well. And so this is a lot of work. And one of the things that I think about working on a CCR is I have a friend, and she and I always talk about patience and persistence. And we talk about power, recognizing our own power, our strength, believing in ourselves, and that we're doing this work with patience and persistence. And I like to talk about the movement of rocks. So particularly someone who lives on the Front Range of the Rocky Mountains. There's a lot of rocks around here. But when we think about rocks, you look down at the ground and it's like, it's just there. And the movement of rocks to me is that rock was moving to get there. And we may have never seen that movement, but it was moving, and it was moving in different ways. And over time it arrived. And so just as we work on the CCR, we are engaged in the movement of rocks. And it may be a slow process, and relationship building is the critical part of it. And we recognize our own power and our power through our beliefs, our custom, our tradition, our culture, how that carries forward. And next slide, please. And on here you have Amber's email address. So Amber Warman is our Children and Youth Coordinator. So you can reach out to her as well. And reach out to Redwind. We're the National Tribal Technical Assistance Provider through the grant to tribal governments. And as a part of that, we also work with responses to tribal college campuses, helping to develop holistic sexual assault responses and the responses for urban natives. And then I mentioned earlier that through the Office for Victims of Crime, we also work with tribes on developing elder abuse multidisciplinary team approaches. So I want to thank everybody for being here today. It was great having this opportunity to share our information with you. Feel free to reach back out to Redwind, and I'm really grateful that Maria shared her contact information as well. And I just want to thank my co-presenter Maria for sharing this time with me. It was great to have this opportunity to work with you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you both. So following this session, there will be an evaluation. We would appreciate any feedback you'd like to share with us. So if you can fill that out, we'd very much appreciate it. All training materials will be accessible by Dropbox once all the sessions are completed, or if requested, they can be emailed to you. This was the last session, so we hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day, and we hope to see you at our next virtual trainings or in-person conferences.